In the corridors of power, whether in boardrooms or personal relationships, true leadership has always been distinguished not by force or manipulation, but by the rare ability to inspire, guide, and elevate others while maintaining one's own integrity. The greatest leaders throughout history understood a fundamental truth. Sustainable influence comes not from dominating others, but from mastering oneself and creating value for those around you. Consider Marcus, a young executive who found himself thrust into a leadership position at a struggling technology company. The previous leadership had ruled through fear and micromanagement, leaving behind a demoralized workforce and declining performance. Marcus faced a choice that countless leaders before him had confronted. Would he continue the cycle of authoritarian control, or would he forge a different path? What Marcus discovered over the following months would transform not only his company, but his understanding of what it truly means to lead. His journey illustrates the 11 fundamental principles of ethical leadership that separate those who merely hold positions of authority from those who genuinely inspire and create lasting positive change. The foundation of self-mastery. Marcus's first revelation came during a particularly challenging board meeting where investors questioned every decision and employees seemed resistant to change. In that moment of intense pressure, he realized that his ability to remain calm, think clearly, and respond rather than react would determine not just his success, but the fate of everyone who depended on the company's survival. The principle of self-mastery forms the bedrock of all ethical leadership. Unlike the crude exercise of power over others, self-mastery requires the far more difficult task of governing one's own emotions, impulses, and reactions. A leader who cannot control their own responses in challenging situations will inevitably make decisions based on fear, anger, or ego, rather than wisdom and strategic thinking. Marcus began implementing a practice that would serve him throughout his career. Every morning, before checking emails or diving into the day's challenges, he spent 20 minutes in quiet reflection. This wasn't meditation in any formal sense, but rather a deliberate examination of his own mental and emotional state. He would ask himself, "What am I feeling? What fears or anxieties might cloud my judgment today? What ego-driven impulses might lead me astray?" This practice of self-awareness became his greatest asset. During a critical negotiation with a potential partner, when the other party became aggressive and accusatory, Marcus found himself able to remain centered. Instead of responding defensively or matching their aggression, he listened carefully, acknowledged their concerns, and redirected the conversation toward mutual solutions. The negotiation that could have ended in conflict resulted in a partnership that saved the company. The principle extends beyond emotional regulation to encompass intellectual honesty. Ethical leaders must be willing to acknowledge their own limitations, mistakes, and knowledge gaps. Marcus discovered this when he initially tried to micromanage the technical aspects of product development, an area where his knowledge was limited. His attempts to assert authority in domains where others had superior expertise created friction and slowed progress. The turning point came when he openly acknowledged to his engineering team that while he understood the business implications of their work, they were the technical experts. He shifted his role from trying to direct their specific methods to clearly communicating objectives and constraints, then trusting them to determine the best approach. This honesty about his own limitations paradoxically increased his authority, as team members respected a leader who valued competence over ego. Self-mastery also requires the discipline to maintain long-term perspective when faced with short-term pressures. During the company's third quarter, when revenue was down and pressure mounted to make dramatic cuts, Marcus felt the temptation to take actions that would improve immediate numbers but potentially damage long-term capabilities. Instead of succumbing to panic, he maintained his analytical discipline, examining which investments would pay dividends beyond the current crisis. He chose to preserve the research and development team despite pressure to eliminate what some viewed as non-essential costs. This decision, which required defending his position to impatient investors, ultimately enabled the company to launch innovative products that drove recovery. The principle of self-mastery had enabled him to resist short-term thinking and maintain strategic focus. The architecture of authentic authority, true authority, Marcus learned, cannot be imposed or demanded. It must be earned through consistent demonstration of competence, integrity, and genuine concern for others' welfare. The second principle of ethical leadership involves building authentic authority through value creation rather than position assertion. Sarah, the head of marketing, initially challenged Marcus's authority at every turn. She had been with the company longer and resented reporting to someone she perceived as less experienced. Rather than engaging in a power struggle or asserting his positional authority, Marcus took a different approach. He began by genuinely seeking to understand her perspective and expertise. In their first one-on-one meeting, instead of outlining his expectations or asserting his vision, Marcus asked Sarah to educate him about the marketing challenges the company faced. He listened carefully, asked thoughtful questions, and took detailed notes. When she finished, he thanked her for the insight and asked what resources or support would enable her to address these challenges most effectively. Over the following weeks, Marcus focused on removing obstacles that hindered Sarah's effectiveness. When she mentioned that approval processes slowed campaign launches, he streamlined decision-making procedures. When she noted that budget constraints limited their ability to test new approaches, he reallocated resources to provide more experimental funding. When she expressed frustration about communication gaps with the product team, he facilitated regular collaborative meetings. The transformation in their relationship occurred gradually. Sarah began seeking Marcus's input on strategic decisions, not because she was required to, but because she found his perspective valuable. She started defending his decisions to other team members and became one of his strongest advocates. Her resistance had transformed into genuine respect because Marcus had demonstrated that his authority was based on value creation rather than position protection. This approach requires genuine humility and confidence in one's ability to contribute meaningfully. Leaders who feel the need to constantly assert their authority typically do so because they lack confidence in their actual value. Marcus discovered that the more genuinely valuable he made himself to others' success, the less he needed to worry about maintaining his position. Authentic authority also requires consistency between private and public behavior. Marcus learned this when he overheard a conversation between two employees discussing a decision he had made. They were speculating about his real motivations, wondering whether his stated concerns about employee welfare were genuine or merely public relations. The conversation made him realize that people constantly evaluate whether leaders' public statements align with their private actions. He began paying careful attention to ensure that his decisions in private meetings, resource allocations, and informal interactions consistently reflected the values he espoused publicly. When faced with budget pressures, he ensured that executive compensation was addressed before considering employee layoffs. When discussing strategy in closed-door meetings, he maintained the same emphasis on ethical considerations that he expressed in company-wide communications. The compound effect of these consistent actions was remarkable. Employees began trusting that Marcus's stated priorities were his actual priorities. This trust eliminated the cynicism and second-guessing that had characterized previous leadership transitions. Team members felt confident that efforts aligned with stated company values would be supported and rewarded, creating a positive feedback loop that reinforced ethical behavior throughout the organization. The dynamics of strategic empathy. The third principle Marcus discovered was the power of strategic empathy. The ability to genuinely understand others' perspectives, motivations, and constraints while maintaining clear judgment about optimal courses of action. This differs from mere sympathy or emotional agreement. Strategic empathy involves deep understanding combined with clear-eyed assessment of situations and relationships. During a challenging period when the company needed to restructure operations, Marcus faced the difficult task of communicating changes that would significantly impact many employees. His natural instinct was to minimize the emotional impact by presenting decisions as unavoidable business necessities, essentially asking people to accept changes without fully acknowledging the personal cost. Instead, Marcus chose to engage in genuine dialogue about the restructuring. He held small group meetings where employees could express their concerns, fears, and suggestions. Rather than defending predetermined decisions, he listened carefully to understand how the changes would affect different individuals and teams. This process revealed considerations he hadn't fully appreciated. One employee, Janet, was responsible for caring for an elderly parent and had structured her work schedule around medical appointments. The proposed restructuring would eliminate the flexibility she needed to manage these responsibilities. Rather than simply explaining why the business requirements took precedence, Marcus worked with Janet and her manager to find creative solutions that met both business needs and personal constraints. Another team expressed concern that the restructuring would eliminate opportunities for professional development that had attracted them to the company. Marcus realized that while the immediate operational changes were necessary, the company could implement alternative development programs that would actually be more effective than the previous approach. This empathetic engagement didn't mean Marcus abandoned difficult decisions or compromised business objectives. Instead, it enabled him to make changes in ways that acknowledged people's legitimate concerns and minimized unnecessary hardship. The restructuring was still challenging, but employees felt heard and respected throughout the process. Many who initially opposed the changes became advocates once they understood the reasoning and saw that their welfare had been genuinely considered. Strategic empathy also proved crucial in external relationships. When negotiating with suppliers who were struggling with their own economic pressures, Marcus found that understanding their constraints enabled more creative solutions than simple price negotiations. By genuinely comprehending their cost structures and market challenges, he could identify ways to modify contracts that reduced their risks while still meeting his company's needs. The principle extends to understanding stakeholder motivations in complex situations. During a potential acquisition discussion, Marcus invested significant time understanding not just the financial aspects of the deal, but the personal motivations of the key decision-makers on the other side. He learned that the founder was primarily concerned about his employees' job security, rather than maximizing his personal financial return. Armed with this understanding, Marcus structured the proposal to emphasize employment guarantees and cultural integration, rather than focusing solely on financial terms. This approach led to successful negotiations where a purely financial focus might have failed. The acquired company's employees remained motivated and productive because they felt their welfare had been prioritized in the transaction. Strategic empathy requires emotional intelligence combined with analytical rigor. Marcus learned to separate his understanding of others' emotional states from his assessment of optimal outcomes. He could genuinely acknowledge someone's disappointment about a decision while maintaining confidence that the decision was correct. This combination of emotional awareness and clear judgment enabled him to maintain relationships even when making difficult choices. The precision of purpose-driven communication, Marcus's fourth major discovery, involved the transformative power of communication that consistently connects immediate actions to larger purposes. Most leaders, he observed, communicate primarily about what needs to be done and when, but fail to consistently articulate why specific actions serve meaningful objectives. The breakthrough came during a period when the engineering team was struggling with motivation while working on what appeared to be incremental product improvements. The work was technically challenging but felt routine, and productivity was declining as talented engineers became disengaged. Traditional motivational approaches, increased compensation, team-building activities, recognition programs, had limited impact. Marcus realized that the engineers understood their technical objectives, but had lost connection with the larger purpose their work served. He began a practice of regularly connecting specific technical challenges to real customer problems and broader market opportunities. Instead of simply requesting faster processing speeds or improved reliability, he shared stories about how these improvements would enable customers to accomplish things that were currently impossible. He arranged for engineers to hear directly from customers about how their products affected real people's lives. When working on optimization algorithms, team members learned about how faster processing would enable real-time analysis for emergency responders. When debugging interface issues, they heard from users about how small improvements could save hours of daily work for thousands of people. This connection to purpose had remarkable effects on performance. Engineers began proposing innovative solutions that went beyond immediate requirements because they understood the broader context. They started collaborating more effectively across teams because they shared a clear vision of ultimate objectives. Most importantly, they sustained motivation through challenging technical problems because they understood why the work mattered. Marcus applied this principle throughout the organization. Financial team members learned how their work enabled better resource allocation for customer-serving activities. Human resources professionals understood how their policies affected the company's ability to attract people capable of solving important problems. Administrative staff saw how their efficiency enabled resources to be directed toward innovation rather than operational overhead. The communication wasn't merely inspirational, it was strategically precise. Marcus connected specific actions to specific outcomes in ways that helped people understand not just what they were trying to accomplish, but how their individual contributions created value. This clarity enabled better decision-making at every level, because people could evaluate their choices against clear criteria. Purpose-driven communication also proved essential in external relationships. When seeking investment capital, Marcus found that investors responded more positively to presentations that clearly connected financial projections to specific value creation rather than simply demonstrating growth potential. When recruiting talented employees, candidates were more attracted to opportunities that clearly articulated how their skills would serve meaningful objectives. The principle requires genuine clarity about purpose rather than manufactured inspiration. Marcus discovered that attempting to motivate people with artificially inflated descriptions of routine work was counterproductive. Instead, he focused on honestly identifying the real value created by different activities and communicating those connections clearly. Even routine tasks could be meaningfully connected to larger objectives when the connections were authentic. Effective purpose-driven communication also requires consistency over time. Marcus learned that people evaluate leaders' sincerity based on whether stated purposes consistently influence actual decisions. When budget pressures arose, his commitment to stated purposes was tested. By maintaining resource allocation that reflected articulated priorities, he demonstrated that purpose statements weren't merely motivational rhetoric, but genuine guides to action. The art of developmental leadership, the fifth principle Marcus discovered, was perhaps the most counterintuitive. True leadership strength is measured not by personal indispensability, but by the capability and independence developed in others. The most successful leaders, he learned, make themselves progressively less necessary for routine operations by elevating the competence and confidence of those around them. This realization came during a crisis when Marcus was hospitalized for a week due to a serious accident. His first concern was that important decisions would be delayed and that problems would accumulate without his direct involvement. To his surprise, the team not only managed effectively in his absence, but actually accelerated progress on several initiatives. Upon his return, Marcus analyzed what had enabled this success. He discovered that over the previous months, without consciously intending to, he had been gradually shifting from making decisions to helping others develop their decision-making capabilities. Instead of simply approving or rejecting proposals, he had been asking questions that helped people think through implications and alternatives. Rather than providing solutions to problems, he had been guiding people through problem-solving processes. When team members brought him challenges, his typical response had evolved from offering answers to asking questions. What factors do you think are most important here? What would success look like? What are the potential unintended consequences? Who else might have relevant insights? This approach initially frustrated some team members who wanted quick answers, but it gradually developed their analytical capabilities. People began bringing him more thoroughly considered proposals. They started anticipating questions he might ask and addressing potential concerns proactively. Most importantly, they gained confidence in their own judgment and began making decisions independently that previously would have required his involvement. Marcus formalized this developmental approach into his leadership practice. In meetings, he consciously created opportunities for others to present ideas, lead discussions, and make recommendations. When mistakes occurred, instead of correcting errors directly, he guided people through analysis of what happened and how to prevent similar problems in the future. He established a practice of regularly delegating decisions that was slightly beyond people's current comfort zones, providing support and guidance but requiring them to exercise judgment and take responsibility. This stretched delegation accelerated skill development while building confidence. People grew into expanded responsibilities because they were given opportunities to succeed in progressively challenging situations. The approach extended to developing leadership capabilities in others. Marcus identified team members who showed potential for greater responsibility and began involving them in strategic discussions, cross-functional projects, and external relationship management. He created opportunities for them to represent the company in situations that developed their professional capabilities and visibility. When Sarah from marketing demonstrated strong analytical skills and collaborative instincts, Marcus began including her in strategic planning discussions beyond marketing. When she offered insights that influenced major company decisions, he ensured she received appropriate recognition. When opportunities arose for external speaking engagements, he recommended her as a representative, helping her develop thought leadership credentials. This developmental approach required Marcus to overcome his own ego-driven tendencies. There were moments when he could have solved problems faster by taking direct action rather than guiding others through solutions. In high-pressure situations, his instinct was to assert control rather than maintain developmental patience. The long-term benefits, however, far exceeded short-term efficiency costs. The organization became more resilient and adaptive because capability was distributed rather than concentrated. Innovation increased because more people felt empowered to propose and implement improvements. Employee satisfaction improved because people experienced genuine professional growth rather than simply executing others' decisions. Developmental leadership also created a positive cycle of talent attraction and retention. Capable people sought opportunities to work in an environment where they would be challenged and supported in expanding their capabilities. The company's reputation as a place where people could grow professionally made it easier to recruit talented individuals who might otherwise pursue opportunities elsewhere. The intelligence of adaptive strategy, Marcus's sixth principle, emerged from recognizing that rigid strategic planning, while providing clarity and direction, often fails in dynamic environments where conditions change faster than plans can be updated. The most effective approach, he discovered, combined clear long-term vision with tactical flexibility and rapid learning cycles. This insight crystallized during a period when the company's primary market segment began shifting due to technological changes. The strategic plan, developed 6 months earlier, assumed stable market conditions and prescribed specific product development priorities. Following this plan would have led the company to invest heavily in capabilities that were becoming obsolete. Rather than abandoning strategic planning or blindly following the existing plan, Marcus implemented an adaptive approach that maintained strategic coherence while enabling rapid response to changing conditions. He separated the strategic planning process into two components: enduring principles and tactical implementations. The enduring principles included the company's core value proposition, fundamental capabilities, and long-term market vision. These elements provided stability and direction but were broad enough to accommodate various tactical approaches. The tactical implementations included specific product features, market entry strategies, and operational procedures that could be modified as conditions changed. Marcus established regular strategic review cycles, monthly rather than annually, where the team evaluated whether current tactical approaches remained aligned with enduring principles and market realities. These reviews focused on learning from recent experience rather than defending previous decisions. Questions included: what have we learned about customer needs? How have competitive dynamics changed? Which of our assumptions have proven incorrect? This adaptive approach enabled rapid response when a major competitor announced a product that threatened the company's market position. Instead of continuing with existing development priorities, the team quickly assessed the implications and redirected resources toward capabilities that would differentiate their offering. The strategic pivot was accomplished within weeks rather than months because the organization was already oriented toward adaptive learning. The adaptive strategy principle also applied to operational management. Marcus learned to distinguish between decisions that required extensive analysis and those that could be made quickly and adjusted based on results. For decisions with low reversal costs, he encouraged rapid experimentation rather than prolonged planning. For decisions with significant long-term implications, he maintained thorough analytical processes. Marketing campaigns became laboratories for learning about customer preferences rather than fixed implementations of predetermined strategies. Product features were released as experiments to gather user feedback rather than complete solutions based on internal assumptions. Operational procedures were treated as hypotheses to be tested and refined rather than permanent policies. This experimental mindset required cultural changes throughout the organization. People needed to become comfortable with uncertainty and iteration rather than expecting definitive answers and permanent solutions. Marcus had to demonstrate that adjusting course based on new information was a sign of intelligence rather than indecision. The approach required sophisticated measurement and feedback systems. The company invested in analytics capabilities that provided rapid insight into customer behavior, market trends, and operational performance. Regular feedback loops enabled quick detection of problems or opportunities that might require strategic adjustment. Marcus also learned to communicate adaptive strategy effectively to stakeholders who preferred predictable plans. He explained that while tactical approaches would evolve based on learning, strategic principles would remain consistent. He demonstrated that adaptive organizations actually achieved more predictable long-term results because they could respond effectively to changing conditions rather than becoming obsolete. The adaptive strategy approach proved especially valuable in external relationships. When negotiating partnerships, Marcus maintained clarity about core objectives while remaining flexible about implementation details. When managing investor relations, he communicated consistent strategic vision while explaining how tactical approaches evolved based on market feedback. The power of principled decision-making. The seventh principle Marcus discovered involved the crucial difference between decision-making based on immediate convenience or advantage versus decisions grounded in consistent principles that serve long-term objectives and ethical standards. This distinction became the foundation for building trust and maintaining strategic coherence across complex situations. The principle crystallized during a contract negotiation where the company had an opportunity to secure a large deal through terms that were technically legal but ethically questionable. The potential client wanted exclusive access to certain technologies but was unwilling to provide corresponding exclusivity commitments. The contract would have generated significant immediate revenue but created precedents that could damage future negotiating positions and partner relationships. Marcus faced pressure from multiple stakeholders to accept the terms. The sales team emphasized the immediate financial benefits and the competitive advantage of securing this prestigious client. The board expressed concern about quarterly numbers and the message that rejecting the deal might send to investors. Some team members argued that competitors would likely accept similar terms if the company declined. Instead of making the decision based on immediate pressures, Marcus returned to fundamental principles. He asked, "What kind of organization do we want to be? What precedents would this decision establish? How would this choice align with our stated values? What would be the long-term consequences of this approach?" The analysis revealed that accepting the problematic terms would contradict several core principles. It would signal that the company's ethical standards were negotiable under financial pressure. It would create expectations that other clients could demand similarly one-sided arrangements. Most importantly, it would damage the culture of principled decision-making that Marcus had been working to establish. Marcus declined the contract, explaining to the potential client that while the company valued their interest, they couldn't accept terms that contradicted their operational principles. He offered alternative arrangements that would meet the client's legitimate needs while maintaining equitable partnership standards. The immediate reaction was mixed. Some team members questioned whether the company could afford to reject significant revenue opportunities based on abstract principles. The client initially expressed disappointment and suggested they would pursue alternatives. Several stakeholders worried about the precedent of declining business for non-financial reasons. However, the long-term consequences validated the principled approach. The client returned several weeks later with a modified proposal that met their needs within the company's standard partnership framework. They expressed respect for the company's consistent standards and indicated that this reliability was valuable in a vendor relationship. The deal that eventually emerged was more balanced and established positive precedents for future negotiations. More importantly, the decision sent clear signals throughout the organization about how decisions would be made. Employees gained confidence that stated principles would influence actual choices, not just serve as public relations messaging. This clarity enabled better decision-making at every level because people understood the criteria that would guide leadership choices. Marcus extended principled decision-making to routine operational choices. When budget pressures arose, cuts were made according to stated priorities rather than political considerations or convenience. When promotion decisions were required, they were based on articulated performance criteria rather than personal relationships or internal politics. When resource allocation conflicts occurred, they were resolved according to strategic objectives rather than departmental influence. The approach required Marcus to develop clear frameworks for applying principles to specific situations. Abstract values like integrity or customer focus needed translation into operational guidelines that could guide concrete choices. He worked with his team to develop decision trees that connected general principles to specific scenarios. The frameworks addressed common ethical dilemmas. How should the company respond when customer demands conflicted with employee welfare? What standards should govern relationships with suppliers facing financial difficulties? How should competitive intelligence be gathered and used? What obligations did the company have to communities where it operated? Having clear frameworks eliminated much of the uncertainty and inconsistency that had previously characterized decision-making. People could predict how leadership would respond to various situations because the underlying principles were known and consistently applied. This predictability created stability that enabled better planning and execution throughout the organization. Principled decision-making also enhanced external relationships. Partners and clients developed confidence in the company's reliability because its responses to various situations followed predictable patterns. Investors appreciated the reduced risk that came from consistent ethical standards. Regulatory relationships improved because the company's behavior aligned with stated policies. The architecture of collaborative excellence, Marcus's eighth discovery, involved understanding that sustainable high performance emerges not from individual heroics or hierarchical control, but from creating environments where diverse capabilities can combine effectively to produce results that exceed what any individual could accomplish alone. This insight emerged during a product development crisis when technical challenges, market pressures, and resource constraints created a complex problem that defied traditional problem-solving approaches. The engineering team understood the technical requirements but lacked market insight. The marketing team understood customer needs but couldn't evaluate technical feasibility. The finance team understood resource constraints but couldn't assess development timelines. Marcus's first instinct was to gather information from each group and make executive decisions that balanced competing requirements. This approach had worked for simpler problems but proved inadequate for the current complexity. The interdependencies were too numerous, and the trade-offs too nuanced for any single person to optimize effectively. Instead, Marcus created a cross-functional team with representatives from engineering, marketing, finance, and operations. Rather than asking them to provide input for his decisions, he charged them with collectively developing solutions that satisfied all legitimate constraints. This approach required new forms of collaboration that went beyond traditional departmental boundaries. The initial meetings were frustrating. Team members spoke different professional languages and prioritized different objectives. Engineers focused on technical elegance. Marketers emphasized customer experience. Finance representatives stressed cost control. And operations people worried about implementation complexity. These different perspectives initially created conflict rather than collaboration. Marcus realized that effective collaboration required more than simply bringing people together. He needed to create structures and processes that enabled different expertise to combine productively. He began by establishing shared objectives that transcended departmental goals. Instead of optimizing engineering performance, marketing effectiveness, or financial efficiency separately, the team would optimize overall customer value creation. He implemented collaborative decision-making processes that required different perspectives to be integrated rather than simply heard. When evaluating product features, the team had to consider technical feasibility, market demand, cost implications, and operational complexity simultaneously. No decision could move forward unless all stakeholders agreed it was viable from their perspective. This integration requirement forced creative problem-solving that discovered solutions invisible to single-discipline approaches. When initial product specifications proved too expensive to manufacture, the collaborative process identified design modifications that reduced costs while actually improving customer experience. When market research revealed demand for features that seemed technically impossible, engineering collaboration with marketing discovered alternative approaches that met customer needs through different technical means. Instead of managing vendor relationships through single points of contact, Marcus created cross-functional teams that worked directly with suppliers' cross-functional teams. This deeper integration enabled joint problem-solving that improved outcomes for both organizations. Customer relationships also became more collaborative. Rather than simply selling products to clients, the company began engaging in joint development processes where customer expertise combined with internal capabilities to create solutions that neither organization could develop independently. These partnerships generated innovations that created value for both parties while strengthening long-term relationships. Marcus learned that effective collaboration required careful attention to both structural and cultural elements. Structurally, he needed to create clear processes for sharing information, making decisions, and resolving conflicts across different functional perspectives. Culturally, he needed to develop norms that valued diverse expertise and rewarded collaborative success rather than individual achievement. The structural elements included regular cross-functional meetings with clear agendas and decision-making protocols. Information systems were modified to ensure relevant data was accessible to all team members rather than siloed within departments. Performance metrics were adjusted to measure collaborative outcomes rather than only departmental results. The cultural elements required more subtle leadership. Marcus began recognizing and celebrating examples of successful collaboration rather than only individual achievements. He modified hiring criteria to emphasize collaborative capabilities alongside technical skills. He adjusted compensation and promotion decisions to reflect collaborative contributions rather than only individual performance. The investment in collaborative excellence paid significant dividends. Product development cycles accelerated because different disciplines worked together from the beginning rather than sequentially. Customer satisfaction improved because solutions addressed multiple dimensions of value rather than optimizing single attributes. Employee engagement increased because people could contribute their full capabilities rather than operating within narrow functional constraints. The collaborative approach also enhanced the organization's learning capabilities. When projects succeeded or failed, the cross-functional teams could conduct comprehensive analyses that identified lessons across all relevant disciplines. This integrated learning prevented repeated mistakes and accelerated the development of organizational capabilities. The discipline of strategic patience, Marcus's ninth principle, involved mastering the difficult balance between urgent action and patient strategic development. In a business environment that often rewards immediate results, he discovered that sustainable success required the discipline to invest in capabilities and relationships that would create value over extended timeframes. This principle was tested during a period when the company faced intense pressure to demonstrate immediate financial improvement. Quarterly results had been disappointing. Competitors were gaining market share and investors were questioning the management team's effectiveness. The obvious responses involved cost reduction, aggressive sales tactics, and operational efficiency improvements that could produce quick results. Marcus recognized that while short-term improvements were necessary, sacrificing long-term capabilities for immediate results would ultimately damage the company's competitive position. He needed to implement changes that addressed immediate pressures while preserving and enhancing strategic assets. The challenge was particularly acute in research and development, where investments required months or years to generate returns. Eliminating R&D expenses would immediately improve financial statements but would leave the company without new products to sustain future growth. Maintaining full R&D investment would satisfy long-term strategic requirements, but would intensify short-term financial pressure. Marcus chose a selective approach that reduced some development programs while accelerating others with higher strategic value. Instead of across-the-board cuts, he worked with the engineering team to identify projects that aligned most closely with long-term market opportunities. Resources were concentrated on fewer initiatives to ensure adequate funding for meaningful innovation. This strategic patience required sophisticated communication with stakeholders who preferred simple explanations and immediate results. Marcus had to demonstrate that current investments would generate future returns while acknowledging legitimate concerns about present performance. He developed detailed scenarios showing how sustained strategic investment would create competitive advantages that purely tactical approaches could not achieve. The principle extended to talent development, where the company continued investing in training and capability development despite short-term budget pressures. While competitors reduced training expenses to improve immediate profitability, Marcus maintained development programs that enhanced employee capabilities and retention. This investment proved crucial when market conditions improved and the company needed skilled people to pursue growth opportunities. Strategic patience also influenced customer relationship management. Rather than maximizing immediate revenue through aggressive pricing or overselling, the company focused on building long-term partnerships that would generate sustained value. This approach sometimes meant accepting lower immediate profits to establish relationships that would be more profitable over time. Marcus learned to distinguish between strategic patience and operational complacency. Strategic patience involved maintaining long-term focus while executing current operations with urgency and efficiency. Operational complacency involved accepting poor current performance while hoping for future improvement. The distinction required clear performance standards for immediate execution combined with sustained investment in strategic capabilities. The approach required sophisticated measurement systems that tracked both short-term performance and long-term strategic progress. Financial metrics were supplemented with indicators of customer satisfaction, employee engagement, innovation pipeline, and market position. These broader measures enabled management to evaluate whether strategic patience was generating expected returns. External stakeholder management became crucial for maintaining strategic patience under pressure. Marcus developed relationships with investors who understood long-term value creation and could support strategic investments through difficult periods. He communicated regularly about strategic progress using metrics that demonstrated advancement toward long-term objectives, even when short-term results were disappointing. The discipline of strategic patience ultimately enabled the company to emerge from the difficult period stronger than competitors who had sacrificed strategic capabilities for immediate results. New products developed during the investment period captured market share when demand recovered. Employees retained during budget pressures became competitive advantages when skilled talent became scarce. Customer relationships strengthened through consistent value delivery generated loyalty that translated into sustained profitability. Strategic patience also enhanced the organization's reputation for reliability and long-term thinking. This reputation attracted business partners, employees, and investors who valued stability and sustained performance over immediate gains. The company's brand became associated with quality and dependability rather than opportunistic behavior. The wisdom of transparent accountability. The 10th principle Marcus discovered was the transformative power of creating systems where performance, decision-making, and outcomes are visible and subject to honest evaluation by those affected by them. This transparency, rather than creating vulnerability, actually enhanced leadership effectiveness by building trust and enabling continuous improvement. The insight emerged during a period when the company was struggling with coordination problems between departments. Projects were delayed because of miscommunication, resources were inefficiently allocated due to incomplete information, and blame shifting prevented effective problem solving. Traditional management approaches focused on identifying and correcting individual mistakes, but this created defensive behavior that obscured systemic issues. Marcus decided to implement radical transparency in his own leadership as a model for broader organizational change. He began sharing his decision-making processes, including the information he considered, the trade-offs he evaluated, and the reasoning behind his choices. When decisions produced poor outcomes, he publicly analyzed what went wrong and how similar mistakes could be prevented. This approach initially felt risky. Exposing his reasoning made it easier for others to identify flaws in his logic or gaps in his knowledge. Acknowledging mistakes created opportunities for critics to question his competence. Traditional leadership wisdom suggested that maintaining some mystique about decision-making preserved authority and respect. However, the results of transparency were remarkably positive. When people understood his reasoning, they could provide better input for future decisions. When they saw him acknowledge and learn from mistakes, they became more willing to admit and address their own errors. When they observed consistent decision-making principles, they gained confidence in his reliability, even when they disagreed with specific choices. Marcus extended transparency to organizational performance measurement. Instead of limiting performance data to management levels, he made relevant metrics available to all employees. Teams could see how their performance affected overall company results. Individuals could understand how their contributions supported collective objectives. This transparency enabled more effective problem-solving because people could identify issues early and suggest improvements based on complete information. When the sales team could see how their activity levels affected product development timelines, they adjusted their approaches to provide more stable planning inputs. When engineers could see how their design choices affected manufacturing costs, they made decisions that optimized total system performance. The transparency also extended to external relationships. Marcus began sharing more complete information with business partners about the company's strategic direction, operational challenges, and performance expectations. This openness enabled partners to align their own strategies more effectively and contribute to mutual success. Customer relationships became more collaborative when the company shared appropriate information about development processes, quality standards, and service capabilities. Instead of maintaining artificial barriers between internal operations and customer interaction, the company enabled clients to understand how their requirements could be most effectively served. Transparent accountability required careful attention to context and appropriate boundaries. Not all information was suitable for universal sharing, and some transparency could create competitive disadvantages or privacy violations. Marcus learned to distinguish between transparency that served legitimate accountability purposes and disclosure that could cause harm. The implementation of transparent accountability also required cultural support for honest evaluation and continuous improvement. People needed to feel safe acknowledging mistakes and discussing performance problems without fear of disproportionate consequences. Marcus had to model the behavior he expected, demonstrating that honest self-assessment was valued more than defensive perfection. Performance evaluation processes were redesigned to emphasize learning and improvement rather than judgment and punishment. When individuals or teams struggled with specific challenges, the focus shifted to understanding root causes and developing solutions rather than assigning blame. This approach encouraged people to surface problems early when they were easier to address. The transparent accountability principle also enhanced decision-making quality throughout the organization. When people knew their reasoning would be subject to review, they invested more effort in thorough analysis. When they understood that outcomes would be honestly evaluated, they took greater care in implementation. When they saw that good decision-making processes were recognized even when results were disappointing, they focused on continuous improvement of their analytical capabilities. External stakeholders responded positively to the company's commitment to transparent accountability. Investors appreciated access to honest assessments of performance and challenges rather than sanitized presentations that obscured important information. Regulatory relationships improved because the company proactively shared information about compliance issues and improvement efforts. The synthesis of ethical leadership. The 11th and final principle Marcus discovered was that effective leadership requires integrating all previous principles into a coherent approach that serves both immediate practical needs and long-term ethical objectives. This synthesis cannot be achieved through mechanical application of rules, but requires developing judgment that can balance competing demands while maintaining integrity. This culminating insight emerged when Marcus faced a complex situation that seemed to create irreconcilable conflicts between different ethical principles. A major client was demanding modifications to a product that would improve their operational efficiency but potentially create safety risks for end users. Refusing the modification would damage an important business relationship and potentially cost employees their jobs. Accepting it would compromise the company's commitment to user safety and product integrity. Traditional approaches to this dilemma would focus on choosing between competing priorities: business success versus safety standards, employee welfare versus ethical principles, short-term survival versus long-term reputation. Marcus realized that effective leadership required finding creative solutions that honored multiple legitimate concerns rather than simply choosing between them. He began by clearly articulating all stakeholder interests affected by the decision. The client had legitimate business needs that drove their request. Employees depended on company success for their livelihoods. End users deserved products that met high safety standards. The company had obligations to maintain its integrity and reputation. Shareholders expected responsible financial management. Rather than viewing these interests as inevitably conflicting, Marcus looked for approaches that could satisfy multiple concerns simultaneously. He assembled a cross-functional team to explore alternatives that might meet the client's operational objectives without compromising safety standards. This exploration revealed technical approaches that had not been initially considered. The collaborative analysis identified modifications that could actually improve both efficiency and safety through innovative design changes. These alterations required additional development investment but created superior products that better served all stakeholders. The client received better operational performance, users benefited from enhanced safety, and the company strengthened its reputation for innovation and quality. This experience taught Marcus that ethical leadership often requires transcending apparent trade-offs by discovering more creative solutions. The integration of multiple principles: collaborative excellence, strategic patience, adaptive strategy, principled decision-making, enabled approaches that served broader sets of interests than conventional choices. The synthesis principle also applied to managing the tension between different leadership responsibilities. Marcus learned to balance his obligations to employees, customers, shareholders, and broader community interests by seeking solutions that created value for multiple stakeholders. This approach required sophisticated analysis but typically produced more sustainable results than approaches that optimized single stakeholder interests. The integrated approach influenced how Marcus developed other leaders within the organization. Rather than teaching isolated leadership techniques, he focused on helping people develop judgment that could balance competing demands while maintaining ethical standards. This development process required exposure to complex situations where principles had to be applied creatively rather than mechanically. Leadership development also emphasized the importance of character formation alongside skill development. Technical capabilities were necessary but insufficient for ethical leadership. People also needed to develop the moral courage to make difficult decisions, the wisdom to understand complex situations, and the integrity to maintain consistent standards under pressure.
Marcus established mentoring relationships where emerging leaders could observe and discuss how experienced leaders navigated complex ethical challenges.
These relationships provided opportunities to explore the reasoning behind difficult decisions and understand how different principles could be integrated in practical situations. The synthesis of ethical leadership also required ongoing personal development. Marcus continued learning from his mistakes, seeking feedback from diverse sources, and reflecting on how his leadership approach could be improved. He recognized that ethical leadership was not a destination but a continuous process of growth and refinement. The integrated approach to ethical leadership created positive cycles throughout the organization. As people experienced leadership that consistently balanced multiple legitimate interests, they developed confidence in the system and increased willingness to contribute their best efforts. As the organization's reputation for ethical behavior spread, It attracted employees, customers, and partners who valued these standards. The company's performance improved, not despite its commitment to ethical leadership, but because of it. The trust and engagement generated by ethical practices enhanced productivity, innovation, and customer loyalty. The long-term perspective enabled by principled decision-making created competitive advantages that purely tactical approaches could not achieve. Marcus's journey in developing ethical leadership capabilities demonstrated that these principles are not abstract ideals, but practical approaches that enhance effectiveness in complex, dynamic environments. The integration of self-mastery, authentic authority, strategic empathy, purpose-driven communication, developmental leadership, adaptive strategy, principled decision-making. By creating environments where people can contribute their full capabilities in service of meaningful objectives, ethical leaders unlock potential that cannot be accessed through manipulation, coercion, or purely transactional relationships. The principles Marcus discovered applied beyond corporate environments to any context where leadership is required, whether in professional organizations, community groups, family relationships, or personal development. The same fundamentals of ethical influence enable people to create positive change while maintaining their integrity and serving others' legitimate interests. The ultimate measure of ethical leadership is not the accumulation of power or the achievement of immediate objectives, but the positive transformation of people and systems that continues long after the leader's direct involvement ends. Marcus learned that true leadership creates capabilities in others that enable them to lead ethically in their own spheres of influence, multiplying positive impact across ever wider circles of relationships and responsibilities. The journey toward ethical leadership requires commitment to continuous learning and growth. The principles provide guidance, but their application requires judgment that develops through experience, reflection, and ongoing engagement with the complex challenges that face anyone who aspires to create positive change in the world. The most important insight Marcus gained was that ethical leadership is not about perfection, but about the sincere effort to integrate competence with integrity, in service of objectives that benefit not just oneself, but all those whose lives are touched by one's leadership influence. In a world that often seems to reward short-term thinking, manipulation, and the pursuit of narrow self-interest, ethical leadership offers an alternative path that serves both individual fulfillment and collective welfare. The principles Marcus discovered demonstrate that it is possible to achieve remarkable results while maintaining the highest standards of integrity and genuine concern for others' welfare. This possibility makes the effort to develop ethical leadership capabilities not just a professional opportunity, but a moral imperative for anyone who aspires to make a positive difference in the world. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.